bus in the forest. What she saw inside made her tremble. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. Write in the comments where you're watching us from. Emily Carter loved her Sunday morning walks. They had become her ritual, a quiet escape from the clamor of life in the small but bustling Oregon town where she worked as a nurse. Her week was always filled with long hours at the clinic, constant phone calls, and endless paperwork. By the time Sunday came around, she craved solitude, the kind that only the dense, sprawling woods near her home could offer. With her dog, Bailey, trotting at her side, tail wagging with uncontainable joy, she could let the stress of the world dissolve into the hush of leaves and birdsong. That morning began like any other. The sky was pale gray, the kind of sky that promised a cool but dry autumn day. Emily zipped her jacket higher around her neck and tucked her hands into her pockets, smiling faintly at Bailey's excitement as he strained against the leash, eager to dart into the underbrush and explore. She loved this about him, the way he treated every walk as if it were his first adventure. The forest greeted them in its usual way, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the crisp scent of pine and damp earth, and a quiet rhythm that seemed to soothe her frayed nerves. Emily usually stuck to the main paths, well-worn trails where other dog walkers or the occasional jogger passed by, offering polite nods and brief greetings. But sometimes, on days when she felt particularly restless, she took smaller side paths, narrow dirt tracks that seemed to promise mystery and solitude. That morning, without really deciding to, she veered left at a fork she'd never noticed before. It was overgrown, almost hidden behind a cluster of shrubs, but something about it called to her. Bailey barked once as if approving of her choice, tugging her forward eagerly. The new path twisted and wound between ancient firs, their towering trunks so close together they blotted out much of the pale sunlight above. Emily felt a thrill she hadn't felt in years, a small, harmless rebellion against the routine. She breathed deeply, letting the air clear her mind. Yet, the further she went, the quieter it became. The cheerful sounds of birdsong faded until only the wind rustling through branches remained. The silence wasn't exactly unsettling, but it was noticeable, enough to make her glance around more often than usual. Bailey bounded ahead, nose pressed to the ground, tail wagging furiously. Emily followed him, stepping over gnarled roots and patches of moss, noticing how unfamiliar everything looked. The trees here were thicker, older, their bark rougher and darker than those near the entrance of the woods. The air was cooler too, damp and heavy like walking into a shadow. Emily glanced back at the path behind her, realizing it had narrowed so much it barely resembled a trail at all. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if she should turn around. But Bailey barked again, and when she looked forward, he was standing at the edge of what looked like an opening in the trees. Pushing past a thicket of brambles, Emily emerged into a small clearing. Her breath caught in her throat. The clearing was overgrown, choked with weeds and tall grass that brushed against her knees. But in the center of it sat something utterly unexpected, an old, rusted bus. It didn't belong there. Emily froze, staring at it. The vehicle was large, clearly once painted blue with red and white stripes running along its side, though the colors had long since faded and peeled away. The windows were shattered or missing entirely, and vines had begun to snake their way through the broken frames, curling along the roof like fingers reclaiming it for the forest. Moss clung to its sides, and one of its tires had sunk so deep into the soft earth it was nearly swallowed whole. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening to the eerie quiet of the clearing. Even Bailey seemed uneasy, his tail no longer wagging as he sniffed the air, ears twitching. Emily felt a faint chill despite her jacket. The sight was strange, almost surreal, as if she'd stumbled into a place where time had stopped decades ago. She took a cautious step forward. There was something deeply unsettling about it, yet she couldn't look away. How long had it been here? Why hadn't she ever heard about it before? She'd lived in this town for years, walked these woods dozens of times, and never once had anyone mentioned an abandoned bus out here. Bailey barked suddenly, the sound sharp in the stillness, making her flinch. He pulled at his leash, sniffing eagerly toward the bus as though drawn to it. Emily hesitated but let him lead her closer, stepping carefully through the tall grass. Each footfall felt louder than it should have, crunching twigs and brushing against leaves, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When she finally stood a few feet away, the details became clearer. The bus was badly weathered, rust eating away at its metal frame. Its front windshield was gone entirely, leaving only jagged shards of glass clinging to the edges. Through it, she could see the driver's seat, slumped and torn, coated in layers of dust and dirt. A faint smell of mildew drifted out from within, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest floor. Emily swallowed, her curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. She'd always been fascinated by forgotten places, but there was something different about this. The bus didn't just feel abandoned, it felt wrong, as if it carried a weight of history that pressed down on the clearing like a shadow. Bailey whined softly, pulling her forward again toward the open door that hung crookedly on its hinges. Emily stared at it, her heart beating faster, unsure whether to follow him inside. She glanced back the way she had come, realizing with a jolt that she could no longer see the path at all. The forest seemed to have closed in around her, swallowing the trail entirely. For a moment, she considered turning around immediately, retracing her steps as best she could and pretending she'd never seen this place. But her gaze returned to the bus, its silent, looming shape against the tangled greenery, and something in her refused to leave. It was as if it was waiting for her. Emily tightened her grip on Bailey's leash and stepped closer, her breath shallow in the cool morning air. Emily hesitated at the threshold, staring into the yawning darkness that swallowed the interior of the bus. The doorway tilted slightly to one side, the rusted hinges creaking faintly in the breeze, and every instinct told her she shouldn't be here. Yet curiosity rooted her to the spot. She felt the leash tug gently in her hand. Bailey was pulling toward the open entrance, nose twitching, tail lowered in cautious curiosity rather than excitement. He whined softly and glanced back at her as if urging her forward. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, each beat louder than the silence around her. The clearing felt isolated in a way she hadn't experienced before. The wind had stilled entirely, and no birds called in the distance. It was as if this forgotten place lay under its own dome of stillness, separated from the rest of the forest. Emily's breath clouded faintly in the chill as she placed one foot on the rusted metal step of the bus, testing it. It groaned under her weight, but held. She climbed up slowly, Bailey pressing close to her leg as though reluctant to be separated. The smell hit her immediately, a pungent mix of mildew, damp rot, and something metallic, like old blood that had long since dried. She wrinkled her nose and forced herself to push forward. Light streamed dimly through shattered windows, scattering across the floor in broken shapes, but the shadows clung thick in the corners, hiding details she could only half make out. Her eyes adjusted, and the interior of the bus began to take shape. The rows of seats were torn apart, foam and fabric spilling from them like exposed innards. Moss grew in patches along the floor where water had seeped in through the broken roof. A layer of dirt and leaves carpeted everything as though the forest itself was creeping in to reclaim it. Emily stepped carefully down the aisle, each movement making the floor groan in protest. What struck her most was how lived in it still felt despite its ruin. Crumpled paper bags were wedged beneath seats, empty juice boxes, long dried and stiff, sitting in cup holders, as if whoever had been here had simply vanished mid-journey. She crouched beside one of the seats and reached for a small, faded backpack lying in the aisle. The fabric was stiff with age, covered in grime. She pulled it open hesitantly and found a few scraps of paper inside, a child's handwriting scrawled across lined sheets. She couldn't read all the words through the smudges, but what she could see was mundane. Field trip today. Can't wait. It felt disturbingly normal, a glimpse into the everyday life of someone who never made it home. Her throat tightened, and she dropped the papers back into the bag, leaving it where it lay. Bailey sniffed at another seat, pawing at something lodged underneath. Emily crouched again, pulling free a small plastic toy, an action figure, faded and missing one arm. She stared at it for a long moment before setting it gently back down. Toward the back of the bus, something caught her eye. A glint of metal peeking out from beneath a collapsed seat drew her closer. Kneeling, she pushed aside a tangle of vines and pried it free. An old compass. Its glass face was cracked and the needle wobbled uselessly in place, spinning without direction. She turned it over in her hand, noticing faint initials etched into the back, R.J. She didn't know why, but the letters made her uneasy. As she stood, her gaze drifted toward the floor near the driver's seat. Half buried in a layer of dirt and leaves was something else, an old key, its brass dulled to a dark brown. Attached to it was a small metal tag, and when she rubbed the grime away with her thumb, her stomach dropped. The date engraved on it read October 18th, 2003. Her birthday. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. She stared at the tag, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over again and again, hoping she'd misread it, that the numbers were different, but no, they were unmistakable. She felt Bailey press closer against her leg, letting out a low whine that echoed in the unnatural quiet. A prickle ran down her spine. The air in the bus felt heavier now, pressing in on her as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. She forced herself to take a step back, clutching the key tightly in her hand. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she suddenly became acutely aware of how alone she was, deep in the woods, far from anyone who could hear her if she screamed. She turned sharply toward the nearest window, needing air, needing light. Outside, the clearing looked unchanged, perfectly still, bathed in pale daylight. Yet somehow it felt different now, ominous, as though stepping into the bus had shifted something subtle but real. Emily raised her phone with shaking hands and snapped a few photos of the interior, the rows of decaying seats, the backpacks, the scattered debris. Then she stepped outside quickly, gulping down the crisp air as if she had been holding her breath for too long. She walked a slow circle around the bus, needing to see it from all sides. The rear was worse than the front. The back door was warped and rusted shut, its paint almost entirely stripped away by time and weather. Thick ivy wrapped itself around the bumper like chains. On the ground nearby, half hidden under a mat of leaves, she spotted a cluster of old shoe prints, so faint they looked fossilized, pressed into hardened mud from years past. They trailed off towards the tree line and disappeared. Emily knelt beside them, brushing at the ground with her fingers. They were small, children's footprints. Her heart clenched. She rose to her feet abruptly and glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the encroaching woods surrounding the clearing. The trees stood silent and tall, dark shadows clustered between their trunks. Bailey growled softly, ears perked towards the tree line as if he'd heard something she hadn't. Emily swallowed hard, gripping his leash tighter. Her gaze fell back to the bus. It loomed there in silence, a monument to something long forgotten, its broken windows staring blankly outward like empty eyes. The key felt heavy in her pocket, its engraved date burning in her thoughts. She didn't understand why it unsettled her so deeply, but it did. Slowly, she stepped backward toward the tree line. She had seen enough for one day, more than enough. As she turned and pushed her way back through the overgrowth, she could feel it behind her still, standing silent and immovable, watching her leave. Emily didn't stop walking until the familiar main trail came back into view. Only then did she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced down at Bailey, who was sticking close to her side, tail low and ears flicking nervously. For once, he wasn't pulling ahead or darting off the path. That evening, after returning home, Emily sat at her kitchen table with the key laid out in front of her. Her laptop glowed in the dim light as she typed into the search bar. Abandoned bus in woods near Ashford, Oregon. The results loaded slowly, each headline making her pulse quicken. Missing school bus, 2003, 15 children and 1 teacher vanish. Search called off after months. Unsolved case haunts small town. Emily stared at the screen, her hand frozen on the mouse. The photos in the articles were grainy, but unmistakable. The bus was the same, down to the faded stripes along its side, and the date engraved on that key matched the day it vanished. She sat back in her chair, heart pounding. It wasn't just an old vehicle left to rust in the woods. It was the bus, the one that disappeared 20 years ago, and somehow she had stumbled right onto it. Emily barely slept that night. Even after she shut down her laptop and turned off the lights, her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts looping back to the rusted bus in the woods, the key she'd found, and the grainy headlines that seemed ripped from some long-forgotten nightmare. 15 children and 1 teacher missing. No bodies, no answers. A search abandoned years ago. The key sat on her nightstand, its dull brass catching the glow from the street lamp outside her window, as if daring her to pick it up and demand an explanation. The engraving haunted her. October 18th, 2003. Her own birthday, the exact date the bus vanished. It couldn't be coincidence, could it? By morning, her exhaustion had settled into a dull, restless determination. She sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee she barely tasted, while Bailey lay curled at her feet, snoring softly. The sunlight filtering through the blinds felt thin and cold, as if even the day itself refused to warm her. She opened her laptop again, unable to help herself, and resumed searching. The internet was a rabbit hole of dead ends, outdated links, and snippets of local lore. There were archived articles from small-town newspapers, their headlines stark and blunt. Ashford community in shock as bus disappears. Search teams comb woods for 7th day. Officials call off rescue effort. She clicked one after another, absorbing details like pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet know how to solve. The bus had been carrying a group of elementary school students on a field trip to a science museum in the neighboring county. Witnesses saw it leave the school in the morning, but it never arrived at its destination. When it failed to show up, authorities launched a massive search effort, focusing on roads, rivers, and eventually the woods near Ashford. For months, volunteers and law enforcement scoured the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs combed trails. Nothing. Not a scrap of evidence. It was as if the bus had simply vanished into thin air. As she read, Emily felt a cold, creeping unease in her chest. There were photos of the children, faded class portraits with smiling faces and missing baby teeth. Their names were listed beneath: Rachel, Aaron, Sophie, Tyler, 15 of them, frozen in time. The teacher's name was Mark Jennings, 34 years old, described as kind and patient by his colleagues. And then there was the one photo that made her stop scrolling entirely. A wide shot of the missing bus, taken weeks before the disappearance. It was unmistakable, even pristine and bright, with its blue paint and red and white stripes unblemished by rust or moss. Seeing it like that, alive and whole, sent a shiver down her spine. But what struck her most were the forums she stumbled upon next. They weren't news sites or official records. They were message boards run by locals and amateur sleuths who had never let the case go. Threads titled Ashford Bus Mystery stretched back over a decade, filled with speculation and rumors. Some claimed the bus had been driven into a hidden ravine or sinkhole. Others spun wild theories about cults or government cover-ups. A few mentioned the woods themselves, calling them cursed, describing compasses spinning aimlessly and eerie sounds that drove hunters away. One post in particular made her pause. It read, "There's a clearing off the old western trail where nothing grows right. My uncle swears he saw something metal there years ago, but could never find it again. Said it gave him the creeps." Emily stared at the words, her heart thudding. She had no doubt now. The clearing she found was that place. The bus wasn't just real. It had been hiding in plain sight, untouched for 20 years, and somehow she'd walked straight into it. She reached for the key on the table and turned it over in her hands, her thumb brushing the engraved date. What did it unlock? Why was it there at all? More unsettlingly, why had it felt so personal, so tethered to her? She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't supposed to have found it, as though stumbling into that clearing had disturbed something meant to stay buried. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from her friend Jason, a reporter at the local paper. He often covered community events and small-town scandals. Nothing like this. She hesitated for a moment, then typed out a message. "Do you remember the school bus case from 2003? He replied almost instantly. "Yeah, why?" Emily stared at the blinking cursor before typing again. "I think I found it." Jason's response was immediate. "What do you mean, found it? You can't be serious." "I am," she typed, fingers trembling slightly. "I was hiking yesterday, and I came across an old bus in the woods. It matches the photos. I even found stuff inside, backpacks, papers, there's no doubt." After a pause long enough to make her doubt if he'd even answer, his reply came through. "Show me." By mid-afternoon, Emily sat at her desk, poring over old scanned newspapers she'd found through the library's online archives. She printed out several clippings, maps of the search area, lists of volunteers, even statements from parents. The words blurred as she imagined what those families had endured. Years of waiting, of unanswered questions, of finally being told the investigation was closed. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned the articles to a corkboard above her desk, arranging them into some semblance of order. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe she needed to see it all laid out to convince herself this was real. that she hadn't dreamed it up in some foggy corner of her imagination. Outside, the sky dimmed early, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The air thickened with the smell of impending rain. Emily sat back, rubbing her temples. Every detail she uncovered only deepened her sense of dread. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back. The thought terrified her, but it felt inevitable. One visit hadn't been enough. She'd left in a haze of fear, but there was more to that place, more to uncover. She told herself it was just curiosity, or a sense of responsibility. Maybe, if she documented it properly, maybe, if she gave the police undeniable proof, the families of those children could finally have answers. She didn't even notice when Bailey padded into the room and rested his chin on her knee, looking up at her with his dark, earnest eyes. She stroked his head absently, her gaze fixed on the key lying beside her keyboard. Its cold weight seemed to anchor her thoughts, pulling her forward toward something she wasn't sure she wanted to face, but couldn't ignore. That night, as rain tapped softly against her windows and the wind whispered through the trees outside, Emily made her decision. She packed a small backpack with a flashlight, gloves, and her phone charger. The bus was waiting. Whatever lay hidden in that shadowed clearing wasn't done with her yet, and she knew she wouldn't sleep until she went back. She set her alarm for dawn. The rain had stopped by the time Emily woke. Her alarm buzzed insistently in the gray hush of early dawn, and she rolled out of bed with a heaviness that came not from sleep, but from anticipation. The world outside her window was still damp and glistening from the night storm, the air so clear it almost shimmered. She dressed quietly, pulling on a heavier jacket this time, lacing her boots with deliberate care. The packed backpack sat waiting by the door, exactly where she had left it the night before. Bailey paced near her feet, tail wagging faintly, sensing something different in her movements, some unusual gravity to the morning's ritual. The drive to the trailhead was silent but steady, the winding road lined with dark, rain-darkened pines. The clouds hung low, but the sun was beginning to push through in faint streaks, painting the forest edges in pale light. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts fixed on the bus, and the images of rusted seats and forgotten toys burned into her mind. Every mile she drove only strengthened the strange pull she felt toward that clearing. When she arrived, the parking lot was empty. That wasn't unusual for this early on a weekday morning, but it heightened the sense of isolation threading through her. She slung her backpack over her shoulders, clipped Bailey's leash, and started down the trail, her boots crunching on the damp earth. The woods were hushed in the aftermath of the rain, drops still clinging to needles and leaves, falling in soft, irregular rhythms from branches high above. At first, everything felt almost peaceful. The familiar parts of the trail soothed her nerves, grounding her in the ordinary sights of ferns, mossy trunks, and the occasional flicker of movement from a distant bird. But as she approached the point where she had veered off before, her pulse quickened. The narrow side path was still there, half concealed by brush. Pushing through it again felt different this time. No spontaneous whim, no idle wandering. Now she moved with purpose. The forest closed in quickly as she followed the faint, overgrown track. Bailey stayed closer than usual, ears twitching as if he too sensed the quiet unnaturalness of this deeper stretch of woods. Emily's flashlight hung from her hand even in daylight. She felt better knowing she had it ready. The further she went, the darker the canopy became, until even the morning sun barely filtered through, turning the world to muted green shadows. Finally, the undergrowth thinned, and the clearing opened before her. There it was. The bus loomed just as it had before, silent and rusting, its faded stripes dull in the pale light. Nothing had changed, yet Emily felt the same sharp rush of unease she'd felt the first time. The clearing still carried that unnatural stillness, like an airless bubble sealed away from the rest of the forest. She tightened her grip on Bailey's leash and stepped forward. Approaching the bus felt like stepping into a memory she hadn't lived but couldn't forget. The broken windows gaped like empty sockets, vines curling tighter through their frames. The door still sagged open, and the interior was as dark as a cave. Emily hesitated at the entrance, then drew in a steadying breath and climbed inside, Bailey pressing close at her side. The air was colder within, heavy with the same mildew and decay. Dust swirled in the faint beams of sunlight slipping through the shattered windows. She switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the rows of ruined seats, the scattered detritus of abandoned lives. This time, she forced herself to look more closely. She crouched near the backpack she had seen before, carefully brushing away layers of dirt and mold. Inside one, she found crumpled worksheets, their ink smudged but faintly legible. Arithmetic problems, a doodle of a sun in one corner. In another, there was a water bottle, still sealed but clouded with age. Every object she touched felt heavy with the presence of its absent owner. Bailey barked once, startling her. His gaze was fixed on something farther back, toward the rear of the bus. Emily followed, her flashlight beam sweeping across torn upholstery and broken flooring until it landed on what he'd found. A small metal box tucked under a partially collapsed seat. She knelt and pulled it free, her gloves scraping against the rusted edges. The box was dented and spotted with corrosion, but its latch gave way with minimal effort. Inside were photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. They showed children smiling at school desks, lining up for recess, posing with friends. Emily flipped through them slowly, her stomach twisting tighter with each face. Then she froze. One photo showed a group of children standing in front of the very bus she was inside now, freshly painted and whole. But what stopped her cold was the writing on the back of one of the photos. "See you soon, Emily." Her breath hitched. Her name in neat cursive letters written in ink that had faded but was still clear enough to read. Her fingers trembled as she held it, and for a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. She didn't know any of these children. She hadn't lived in Ashford in 2003. None of it made sense. Bailey whined softly, pressing against her leg. She stuffed the photo back into the box, closed it, and shoved it into her backpack. The unease she'd felt before was turning into something sharper now, an almost physical sense of being watched. She shined her flashlight around the bus one last time, scanning every shadowed corner, but saw nothing out of place. Yet, the silence pressed against her eardrums until it almost rang. She stepped out into the clearing again, gulping down fresh air. The forest around her felt oppressive now, the tree line dark and close. Bailey's ears twitched and he let out a low growl, staring towards the far edge of the clearing. Emily followed his gaze, her skin prickling. The trees there were dense, tangled together so tightly that they formed an almost impenetrable wall of green. But she noticed it then, a faint gap, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Her pulse quickened. Beyond that gap lay only shadows, but something about it tugged at her attention. It aligned perfectly with where she had seen those faint footprints before, the ones leading away from the bus. She hesitated, staring, weighing the gnawing curiosity against the tightening fear coiling in her stomach. Bailey barked once, sharp and insistent, and the sound seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness. Emily took a step toward the gap. The air grew cooler as she pushed through the thicket, branches scraping her jacket and snagging at her hair. On the other side, the forest opened slightly, revealing a faintly discernible trail leading deeper into the woods. It was narrow, almost hidden, but unmistakably a path worn by many footsteps long ago. Emily felt her throat dry. This wasn't random. Whatever happened here, this was where it led. She gripped Bailey's leash tightly and began to follow. The narrow trail swallowed Emily almost immediately. The gap she had pushed through sealed behind her with a curtain of branches and undergrowth, and for a fleeting moment she felt the irrational fear that if she turned back, she wouldn't find her way out again. The canopy overhead thickened, blotting out much of the already muted daylight, and the air was damp and cool, smelling faintly of wet earth and rotting leaves. Bailey pressed close to her leg, ears alert, his tail low, every step betraying his unease. Emily moved slowly, her flashlight in one hand, though it was still day, its beam cutting through the dimness like a thin blade. The path underfoot was barely visible, only slightly more compacted than the forest floor around it, and here and there she could see shallow impressions in the soil. Footprints. Most were smoothed over by time, but they ran parallel to the trail as though countless feet had trodden this way long ago, leading ever deeper into the woods. Each step Emily took felt heavier, the sense of being pulled forward stronger than any rational explanation she could offer herself. Her thoughts spun as she walked. The photo she'd found in the bus pulsed in her mind, her name written neatly on its back, tied inexplicably to children who had vanished 2 decades ago, long before she'd even moved to Ashford. She thought of the bus itself, sitting undisturbed all those years, and of the key she'd found beneath its rusting frame, its engraved date aligning precisely with her birthday. The coincidences stacked on top of each other until they no longer felt like coincidences at all. The further she went, the more she noticed signs that people had once been here. Bits of decayed fabric snagged on branches, rusted cans barely visible under moss, and here and there, trees with faint marks carved into their bark, simple lines and symbols whose meanings she couldn't guess. They weren't random scratches. They felt purposeful, though age had blurred their sharpness. After what felt like an hour of slow progress, the trail dipped downward, and Emily noticed a sound she hadn't heard in this part of the forest before, the faint rush of running water. It grew louder until she emerged at the edge of a shallow stream, its surface glinting dimly through the canopy above. A narrow, weathered bridge spanned it, its wooden planks sagging but intact. Moss grew thick on the handrails, and when she stepped onto it, the wood groaned under her weight. Bailey hesitated but followed, nails clicking softly against the slick boards. On the other side, the path widened slightly, more obvious now, as though whatever had been here had once been traveled frequently. Emily's flashlight beam swept ahead and froze on something pale against the dark ground, a scrap of cloth, dirty but still intact enough to reveal a faded cartoon character printed on it. It was the kind of design a child's shirt would bear. She crouched, staring at it, then carefully picked it up with gloved hands. It felt brittle, as if it might tear apart at the slightest pull, but it was unmistakably real. Her heart thudded faster. Someone had been here, and not just once. The path continued forward, curling upward along a low ridge. Bailey whined softly, pressing closer, and Emily soothed him absently, though her own nerves were fraying. Each step felt like peeling back another layer of something that had been deliberately hidden. At the top of the ridge, she paused and drew in a sharp breath. Ahead, through the trees, she could see a structure. It was distant enough to be obscured by the forest's dense weave, but unmistakably there. Angular lines breaking through the natural shapes of the woods. As she moved closer, it became clearer. It was a building. Or rather, what was left of one. The structure was low and sprawling, built of wood and stone, its roof sagging and partially caved in, its walls mottled with mold and decay. Windows gaped empty, frames splintered and warped by years of exposure. Nature had claimed much of it, ivy crawling over its sides, roots cracking through the floorboards visible even from outside. Emily stopped at the edge of the clearing that surrounded it, her pulse roaring in her ears. Bailey growled softly, his gaze fixed on the building. Emily crouched to steady him, her eyes scanning the area. The clearing bore faint signs of old use, what looked like the remnants of a fire pit, stones blackened and scattered, rusted metal scraps half buried in the soil, and even a few overturned benches that might once have served as seating. Emily stepped forward, her boots crunching on the leaf-strewn ground. The building loomed larger with each step, its doorway hanging crookedly, an empty void framed by splintered wood. She hesitated at its threshold, feeling again that inexplicable heaviness, like the air itself resisted her entry. Then she pushed inside. The interior was dim and smelled of damp wood and mold. Her flashlight beam cut across a wide room lined with what had once been rows of bunk beds. Most had collapsed into twisted heaps, their mattresses rotting in piles on the floor. The walls bore peeling paint, beneath which faint outlines of old posters could still be seen. Bright colors dulled and illegible from age. Emily's breath hitched as her beam passed over a small desk tucked against the far wall, a rusted metal frame supporting a surface scattered with papers and decayed notebooks. She approached cautiously, brushing away dirt and leaves. The papers were water-stained and crumbling, but one notebook caught her attention, its cover intact, its pages surprisingly legible inside. She opened it carefully, heart pounding. The handwriting was precise, steady, clearly that of an adult. The first few entries were mundane, notes about schedules, meal plans, and the names of the children. Then they grew stranger. The entries became more erratic over time, letters slanting, words frantic. Something is wrong here. We've been hearing sounds at night. The bus is gone. I don't know what to tell them. Emily's stomach knotted. The final entry, scrawled unevenly across the last page, chilled her. It read simply, "We can't leave. The woods won't let us. If anyone finds this..." The sentence ended there, the pen trailing off into a jagged line. She lowered the notebook slowly, staring at it, her breath shallow. Bailey whined again, pulling at his leash toward the door, but Emily's eyes drifted toward another doorway at the far end of the room. It hung half open, and beyond it lay darkness deeper than the rest of the building. She moved toward it cautiously, her beam steadying her. Inside was a smaller room. Shelves lined the walls, holding objects preserved better than the rest, cans of food, long expired, jugs of water coated in dust, and boxes labeled in faded marker. On one shelf rested another stack of photographs, more recent than the ones in the bus. She picked them up, flipping through. They showed the children again, but not smiling this time. Their faces were solemn, some frightened. In the background of one picture, through a window, Emily saw something else. The bus itself, bright and new, parked outside this very building. Her fingers tightened on the photos. She realized now what this place must be. A camp or lodge, abandoned for decades, used briefly as shelter by the missing bus passengers before they disappeared entirely. But why had no one ever found it? It wasn't that far from the main trails. A faint noise broke her thoughts. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it came from outside. A crunch, like footsteps on leaves. Bailey's growl deepened. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she turned off her flashlight instinctively, plunging the room into darkness save for the weak daylight filtering in through the cracks in the walls. She stood frozen, straining to listen. Silence followed, then another faint sound, closer this time. Someone else was out there. Emily's breath felt trapped in her chest as she stood motionless in the darkened room, every muscle taut and waiting. Bailey's growl was low and steady, vibrating against her leg, his ears pinned back and his gaze fixed toward the doorway. The faint crunching noise outside came again, measured, deliberate, not the random scurry of an animal. Whoever or whatever it was moving slowly, as if aware it was being listened to. She gripped Bailey's leash tightly, her knuckles white around it, and forced herself to take a silent step back from the shelves. Her mind raced. Had someone followed her here? Was this place not as forgotten as it seemed? She glanced toward the windows of the lodge's main room, their glass long gone, leaving only jagged frames and open space. Beyond them, the forest stood still and watchful, a lattice of trunks and shadows. She saw nothing, but the sense of being observed clung to her skin like damp air. The sound came again, closer now just beyond the wall. Bailey lunged forward once, and Emily barely restrained him, her heart pounding so hard she felt lightheaded. For a fleeting second, she considered calling out, demanding to know who was there, but instinct told her to stay silent. Slowly, deliberately, she eased backward toward the doorway leading into the main room, her flashlight clutched tightly in her other hand but still switched off. She didn't want to announce her exact position with a beam of light cutting through the shadows. She reached the main room and pressed her back against the wall, straining to hear. The forest was quiet again. No crunching steps, no rustle of leaves. The only sound was Bailey's quickened breathing, matching her own. Emily forced herself to take a steadying breath and flipped her flashlight back on. The beam illuminated the room's decaying bunks, the collapsed mattresses, the litter of old papers and broken furniture. Nothing moved. Gathering her courage, she crossed the room to one of the gaping windows and peered outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The trees stood silent and dense, their branches heavy with moisture. No figure waited in the shadows. No eyes glinted back at her from the darkness. And yet, the oppressive feeling remained, a heaviness pressing down as though the woods themselves were aware of her presence and disapproved. Emily forced herself to move forward. If she froze, she'd never leave. The doorway at the far end of the lodge loomed, the one she had noticed earlier. It appeared to lead down a short corridor toward another section of the building. Bailey hesitated, ears flat, but she coaxed him forward gently, her voice barely above a whisper as she reassured him. She stepped into the hallway, her flashlight beam revealing more peeling walls and warped wooden floors. At the end of the hall stood a door, its paint chipped, hinges sagging. Emily reached out and pushed it open slowly, the hinges squealing faintly. The smell that hit her was different from the rest of the lodge, not just mold and damp wood, but something earthier, stale in a way that suggested this room had been sealed far longer than the others. Inside was what appeared to be an office. A heavy wooden desk dominated the space, and its surface cluttered with papers, a rusted lantern, and a toppled chair lying on its side. Filing cabinets stood against one wall, their drawers partially open, papers spilling out and littering the floor. Emily moved toward the desk, brushing away a thick layer of dust with her gloved hand. The papers on the desk were ledgers and logs, dates scrawled across their headers in bold handwriting. They spanned months leading up to October 2003. Most entries were mundane. Supply inventories, lists of staff names and shifts. But as Emily flipped through them, the handwriting changed, growing tighter, slanted, rushed. Notes began appearing in the margins, hurried and disjointed. Children restless. Keep them inside after dark. Sound outside again last night. Her stomach tightened as she reached the last dated entry. It was shorter than the rest, written in jagged strokes. We can't risk moving them tonight. Stay together. Pray morning comes. Emily set the ledger down slowly. Her flashlight beam drifted toward the corner of the room, where a dusty corkboard still clung to the wall. Pinned to it were more photographs, curling with age. Some showed the children again, sitting in rows on the lodge steps, their faces solemn but unharmed. Others showed crude maps drawn in pen, paths through the woods marked with arrows and notations, one circle drawn heavily in ink around an area labeled simply Bus. Beside the maps was a single sheet of lined paper with a list of names, 15 children, and at the bottom, the teacher's name, Mark Jennings. Each name had a check mark next to it, except 2. The unchecked names were faintly smudged, but she could still read them. One was Tyler Adams. The other was Sophie Lang. Emily's pulse quickened. Why hadn't they been checked off? She turned suddenly at a noise from behind her. A faint creak, wood shifting under weight. She swung her flashlight toward the doorway. Bailey barked once, sharp and explosive in the stillness. Emily's breath caught as the beam illuminated nothing but the empty hallway beyond. Yet she could have sworn she'd heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from the door. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. She grabbed her phone and snapped photos of the desk, the corkboard, the maps, and the list of names before backing toward the hall. Bailey's leash pulled taut in her hand as he strained toward the exit, whining now instead of growling. As she emerged into the main room again, she cast one last glance around. Her flashlight swept over the bunk beds, the scattered debris, and stopped on the far wall. For the first time, she noticed faint writing scrawled across the wood in thick, dark strokes. She moved closer, the beam steady on the words. It read, "The woods keep what they take." Her mouth went dry. The letters looked carved hastily, uneven and raw, as if scratched into the wood with something sharp in desperate haste. Beneath them was another smaller phrase, barely legible. "If you see the bus, turn back." Emily felt a chill climb her spine. Whoever had written it had known exactly what they were warning against, and she had walked straight into it. Suddenly, the oppressive silence of the clearing outside broke again with a sound. A snap, loud and clear like a branch breaking underfoot. Bailey barked wildly now, lunging toward the open window. Emily turned, her heart hammering, and aimed her flashlight toward the clearing. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw movement near the tree line. A figure darting between trunks, there and gone so fast she couldn't be sure. Her breath caught, frozen in her chest. Bailey barked again, fur bristling, his body rigid. Emily didn't wait to see more. She grabbed his leash and ran for the lodge's entrance, boots pounding against the warped floorboards, her flashlight beam jolting wildly across the walls. She burst out into the clearing, spinning in every direction, the forest looming dense and dark around her. There was nothing there. No figure, No sound now but her ragged breathing. The trees stood silent again, but their stillness felt heavier than before, as if they were closing in, watching. Emily didn't care any more about caution or answers. Clutching Bailey's leash tight, she plunged back toward the narrow trail, her flashlight guiding her trembling steps, and didn't stop until the lodge and its clearing vanished behind her. Emily didn't stop moving until she was back on the familiar trail that led to her car. Her lungs burned from exertion, and every sound of snapping twigs or rustling leaves behind her set her nerves on edge. Bailey pulled hard at his leash, as if he too wanted to be anywhere but there, his pace frantic. When she finally reached the parking lot, she collapsed into the driver's seat, hands trembling on the steering wheel, heart still hammering. She sat there for a long while, staring blankly ahead, her mind replaying every moment inside the lodge, the writing on the wall, the photographs, the maps, and the unmistakable feeling that she had not been alone. When she finally turned the key in the ignition and drove away, her eyes darted to the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see something emerging from the woods behind her. But the road remained empty, and soon the trees gave way to the outskirts of town, then to streets lined with familiar houses that looked impossibly normal compared to the nightmare she'd just walked out of. At home, she locked the door immediately, pulling every curtain shut. Bailey paced near the window, whining softly until he eventually curled up beside her on the couch, as if unwilling to leave her side. Emily set her backpack on the table and emptied its contents: the photographs from the bus, the scrap of fabric she'd found, the dusty notebook from the lodge, and the pictures she'd taken with her phone. Spread out like that, they looked even more damning, pieces of a mystery that had been buried for decades. She picked up the notebook again, staring at the frantic handwriting of its final entries. The words replayed in her mind. "We can't leave. The woods won't let us." They didn't sound metaphorical anymore. Something about that place had been wrong in a way she couldn't define, but had felt deep in her bones. She remembered the sound of footsteps outside the lodge, the fleeting glimpse of movement near the tree line, and the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all natural noise whenever she drew near the bus or the clearing. For hours, she sat at her kitchen table researching again, this time cross-referencing everything she'd uncovered. She found more old articles she hadn't seen before, buried deep in digital archives, interviews with desperate parents, speculation from law enforcement, even a few cryptic quotes from early search teams about the difficulty of navigating that particular stretch of forest. One search volunteer had told a local paper, "It's like the woods rearranged themselves overnight. Places we mapped one day would look different the next. Trails we marked vanished." Emily felt her chest tighten as she read. They'd suspected it then, too, even if they couldn't explain it. That was why no one had found the lodge or the bus all those years ago, not because they hadn't looked hard enough, but because the forest itself had kept them hidden. When Jason arrived that evening, she practically dragged him inside, shoving the evidence across the table. His eyes widened as he sifted through the photographs and papers, the disbelief etched on his face slowly giving way to grim concern. She recounted everything, finding the bus, the key with her birth date engraved on it, the footprints, the abandoned lodge, the message carved into the wall, and the sounds outside that left her certain she wasn't alone. Jason was quiet for a long time afterward, tapping one finger against the tabletop as he stared at the pile. "Emily," he said finally, his voice low, "this isn't just some abandoned site. This is bigger than you realize. If what you're saying is true, this could reopen the entire case." They debated whether to go straight to the authorities. Emily felt uneasy at the idea. Part of her feared they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they'd dismiss it all as coincidence or urban legend. But Jason insisted. He reminded her of the families who'd waited 20 years without closure, of how her photos and physical evidence were more than enough to get law enforcement involved. After an hour, she relented. The next morning, they went together to the police station. Emily presented everything: the photographs from her phone, the notebook, the maps, even the key. The detective they met listened carefully, his expression tightening as he studied the evidence. He admitted he'd grown up in Ashford and remembered the case vividly. Within days, a small investigative team was dispatched to the woods, guided by the coordinates Emily provided from her phone's GPS. When they returned, the news broke like a wave through town. The bus had been found exactly where Emily described, hidden deep in an unmarked clearing beyond overgrown paths. Authorities confirmed the discovery publicly, showing images of the rusted vehicle that matched perfectly with the 20-year-old photos from the missing persons case file. The story spread quickly, igniting headlines. Ashford mystery reopened after 2 decades. Local woman uncovers site of missing bus. In the days that followed, search teams combed the area around the bus and the lodge. They uncovered remnants of old supplies, more personal items belonging to the children, and even a few skeletal remains partially buried beneath layers of soil and leaves near the lodge's perimeter. Though DNA testing would take time, investigators confirmed they believed these remains belonged to at least some of the missing passengers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Families who had spent years without answers wept openly on the news, thanking Emily for coming forward. Yet, despite the relief her actions brought, the unease gnawed at her still. She couldn't stop thinking about the things that hadn't been explained, the untouched condition of certain items despite decades of exposure, the strange writing carved into the walls, and most of all, the sense of being watched. Jason visited often in the weeks that followed, urging her to rest, but Emily found herself drawn back to the case even after it was officially reopened. She pored over every update from investigators, each report confirming what she already knew. The bus had vanished for reasons no one could fully account for. There were no obvious roads leading to it, no plausible explanation for how it ended up so far into the woods without a trace of its path being found before. One evening, weeks after the discovery, she sat alone in her living room, scrolling through her phone. An article caught her eye, a short update buried beneath larger headlines. Investigators had uncovered a second set of footprints near the lodge, separate from those leading to or from the bus. They were faint but larger, adult-sized, and recent enough to be concerning. Emily's stomach dropped. She thought of the sound of footsteps outside the lodge, the glimpse of movement in the trees. Whoever it had been, they hadn't been part of the original tragedy. Someone else had been there, someone alive. She closed the article, her hands trembling. In her mind's eye, she saw again the carving on the wall. The woods keep what they take. She wondered if it was a warning or a simple statement of fact. Even as police cordoned off the area and patrols were increased, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something about that forest wasn't done with her. At night, lying awake, she found herself thinking about the bus and the clearing, about how easily she had stumbled onto them after years of failed searches by others. She remembered the way the trees seemed to shift and close in, as if guiding her forward. She told herself she wouldn't go back. She meant it, truly. Yet sometimes when Bailey barked at nothing near the edge of her yard or when she saw movement in the shadows just beyond the streetlight's reach, she wondered if perhaps the woods had chosen her for a reason. And late one evening, when she couldn't sleep, she opened her laptop and pulled up the maps again. Her eyes lingered on the area around the clearing, tracing the empty spaces marked with nothing but green, spaces that hadn't yet been searched. She shivered, closed the laptop, and turned off the light. But even in the dark, her mind didn't stop circling back to the same thought. If the woods could keep what they take, then what else was still out there waiting to be found? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more stories like this, and don't forget